Richard Rich Miller never wanted much, just a quiet life after decades of intense government work as an internal investigator. At 50, he retired early and moved to a picturesque, sun-drenched Arizona neighborhood nestled in the foothills outside Tucson. A small cul-de-sac promised peace, privacy, and a stunning canvas for his favorite pastime, cultivating rare desert cacti. His backyard quickly transformed into a cactus haven towering saguaros, flowering barrel cacti, and radiant prickly pears. Each plant told a story, each one named after famous lawmen from the Old West. To Rich, the cacti weren't just plants. They were resilient, silent survivors. Like him, neighbors waved politely. Some even asked for cactus care tips, but not everyone was impressed. Across the street lived Evelyn Evie Sterling, the newly appointed HOA president, a former defense attorney with a reputation for bulldozing opposition in court. She had recently taken her talents to what she called neighborhood compliance enforcement. From the moment Rich met her wearing designer sunglasses, holding a clipboard, and assessing his garden, he knew there would be trouble. Evie Sterling wasn't elected. She seized control when the previous president abruptly stepped down. Under her leadership, the HOA bylaws were revised, reprinted, and reinterpreted. Her emails flooded inboxes with bold text, vague threats, and flowery language like mandatory aesthetic cohesion and visual tranquility standards. Rich's cactus garden, despite being on private property and behind a privacy fence, was the first to violate her vision. It started subtly, a friendly note about spine hazards near the property line, then a formal citation for excessive pointy growths. Rich laughed at first. He thought it was satire. When the second letter arrived with a $250 fine, he realized she was serious. He responded in writing, attaching pictures and copies of local ordinances confirming that his plants were legal and his landscaping was within code. Evie replied with legalist-laced rebuttals. The fines doubled, the violations grew petchier. Rich was cited for listening to history podcasts on his porch too loudly. A chessboard left on a patio table was labeled public clutter. A hummingbird feeder was deemed a nuisance. A tractor. Each week brought a new citation, each more absurd than the last. It wasn't about rules, it was about control. Rich documented everything. He kept a binder full of letters, screenshots of emails, and time-stamped photos of his property. He even installed a motion-activated trail cam aimed at his gate. He hoped to catch whoever was sneaking onto his property to measure cactus width or angle. One morning, he caught Evie herself, standing behind his gate with a tape measure. When she realized she was on camera, she retreated quickly. That same week, Rich received another violation, hostile horticulture. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so maddening. Rich began losing sleep. His dream retirement was becoming a bizarre nightmare. By the end of the third month, Rich was drained. He'd lived through government audits, hostile witness, interrogations, and surveillance ops. Yet nothing rattled him like this HOA president with her pastel binder and her designer boots stepping over his mulch beds. He considered moving, selling the house, giving up. It wasn't worth the mental toll. Then, in one emotional call to his son Brendan, Rich vented everything: the fines, the threats, the cameras, the absurdity. There was a long pause. Brendan, a Navy SEAL with a sharp mind and a deadpan voice, said only this: "Greater than I'm coming." That single sentence shifted the energy. Brendan wasn't just visiting. He was investigating. Brendan arrived 2 days later, wearing gym shorts and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't announce himself. He greeted his father, walked the perimeter of the property, and quietly surveyed the neighborhood. Then he opened the HOA documents and bylaws. "I've seen cleaner operations in war zones," Brendan muttered. By nightfall, he'd installed new cameras with wide-angle lenses. He skimmed the HOA's entire codebook, highlighting vague clauses and loopholes. He noticed that many of Rich's violation photos appeared to be taken from the same two angles, meaning someone was entering the property or using a hidden vantage point. Brendan set up a hidden GoPro in the eaves of the roof and added a Wi-Fi motion sensor at the front gate. Let's play their game, but smarter. Within days, the cameras captured HOA board members and even a landscaper trespassing during the night to measure plants and peek over the fence. One man urinated near Rich's cactus beds. Brendan compiled timestamps, face IDs, and chain of custody reports like he was preparing for military court. "We don't just fight them," he said, "we expose them." Rich felt something he hadn't in weeks: hope. Late one night, with curiosity festering and sleep refusing to come, Evie began combing through old HOA meeting minutes she found on a private neighborhood forum. There, she uncovered something sinister. Margaret had a history of targeting residents who introduced native landscaping, using obscure bylaw amendments and exaggerated claims of property value depreciation. The documents revealed that Margaret was a former realtor who had financial ties to a landscaping company that specialized in conventional turf maintenance. The more non-compliant homes she could find or coerce into conversion, the more kickbacks she earned through the landscaping contracts handed out by the HOA. Evie's fingers trembled as she downloaded and saved everything she could find. This wasn't just petty harassment, it was a system of extortion cloaked in regulation. With this knowledge, she began planning a response not just to protect her own yard, but to challenge Margaret's entire regime. Evie anonymously leaked some of the HOA documents to a local journalist known for exposing municipal corruption. Within days, an article titled "Green Gardens, Red Flags, HOA Tied to Landscaping Scam" appeared on a popular community news blog. The piece was picked up by regional outlets and a public outcry erupted. Neighbors who had once silently complied began questioning Margaret's motives. More homeowners came forward with stories of being fined for wildflowers, native shrubs, or even bird feeders. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded with threads of outrage, support, and shared horror stories. Margaret tried to downplay the article, calling it a smear campaign led by uninformed radicals. But the damage was done. She was no longer the untouchable HOA matriarch, she was now the face of controversy. Despite the controversy, Margaret scheduled a formal HOA disciplinary hearing to vote on forcing Evie to remove her cactus garden. The hearing was to be held in the community clubhouse and was open to all homeowners. Evie showed up early, armed with her binder of bylaws, her research into Arizona's native plant protection laws, and a printed copy of the news article. The room filled quickly. More than 60 residents came, far more than usual for an HOA meeting. Margaret opened the session with her usual sanctimonious tone, reading a long list of supposed violations from Evie's property. But this time, Evie didn't wait for the gavel to fall. She stood up, countered every point with legal citations, and then dropped the bombshell. What Margaret didn't disclose is her financial ties to companies that profit when yards are stripped and resodded. Gasps filled the room. Someone in the back yelled, "Is that true?" Others demanded to see financial records. Margaret's face flushed red, and for the first time, she was at a loss for words. Following the explosive meeting, several board members began to distance themselves from Margaret. Vice President Joel Dawson resigned, citing ethical conflicts and leadership concerns. Treasurer Dana Harlow called for a full audit of the HOA's financial decisions over the past 5 years. A petition began circulating to hold a special election to remove Margaret from the presidency. Evie didn't stop there. She and several neighbors formed a grassroots group called Desert Defenders, focused on promoting sustainable, native landscaping and protecting homeowner rights. They began hosting community workshops, bringing in horticulturists and environmental lawyers to educate the neighborhood. Margaret responded by going on a tirade via the HOA email list, accusing Evie of environmental extremism and trying to dismantle neighborhood harmony, but no one was buying it anymore. Evie's older sister, Carmen, flew in from Santa Fe. Carmen wasn't just family, she was a powerhouse environmental attorney with years of courtroom experience battling shady zoning boards and rogue HOAs. After a long dinner filled with laughter, tears, and strategy talk, Carmen agreed to represent Evie pro bono. Within a week, Carmen filed a formal complaint against the HOA for harassment, illegal fines, and failure to uphold state environmental protection laws. She attached the article, the internal documents, and testimonies from over a dozen residents. Margaret was officially put on notice. If she continued her campaign, she'd face a lawsuit that could bankrupt the HOA and her own credibility. At the next board meeting, Carmen delivered a fiery speech on behalf of Evie, complete with references to the Arizona Revised Statutes and the Environmental Quality Act. Her presence was electric. Margaret didn't interrupt once. The board was forced to table all pending disciplinary actions against Evie and a special election date was set. The tides had turned. Brendan had always been prepared for a dirty fight, but the emotional impact of seeing his father's beloved cactus garden razed to the ground added fuel to his resolve. The cameras he had discreetly placed in the mailbox post and near the porch weren't just for protection, they were the foundation of their counterattack. That evening, in the dim glow of his father's study, Brendan meticulously reviewed the footage. The video showed 2 HOA board members entering the yard at 3:42 a.m., armed with shovels and sacks. Under cover of darkness, they ripped out the plants, dragged them away, and crushed several pots. It was clear, malicious vandalism and worse trespassing. Brendan compiled the footage into a clean, time-stamped package. He overlaid notes referencing local statutes and HOA bylaw violations. Then, he backed it up on 3 different devices. They had them, Evie, smug and unshaken, strutted into the HOA meeting with a clipboard in hand. The community room buzzed with murmurs. Many residents had gathered, some out of curiosity, others out of concern. Evelyn Sterling called the meeting to order with her usual imperious tone. "We've had reports of instability and disruptive behavior," she began. "Mr. Miller and his son have created unrest, disregarded community standards, and harassed members of this association." Brendan stood quietly until she finished her opening remarks. Then, he asked to speak. Evie, expecting resistance, allowed it with a condescending smirk. "By all means." Brendan pulled a small remote from his pocket. The projector flickered to life. Let's watch something together. What followed was 10 minutes of unedited, irrefutable evidence. The room fell silent. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The time stopped, the faces of the two HOA members. The destruction it all played like a short film of guilt. At the end, Brendan displayed a chart comparing all the HOA fines issued over the last year. 80% had been directed at Rich. The rest were sporadic and mostly issued to anyone who opposed Evelyn. This isn't enforcement, Brendan said. It's a campaign of harassment, and it ends tonight. Evelyn tried to maintain her composure, but the silence was damning. When she attempted to speak, one resident stood, then another, and another. Each told their story about unfair warnings, fines, sudden citations for trivial issues. I got fined for my wind chimes, said a woman in the front row. I was told I couldn't paint my mailbox the color it's been for 12 years. She threatened me with legal action over my toddler's sidewalk chalk. The tide had turned. Someone called for a vote to remove Evelyn from her position. By the end of the night, she had lost the presidency by a landslide. A recall petition followed immediately, and her two co-conspirators were suspended pending investigation. Brendan handed all documentation and footage to a property rights attorney, and then to the county sheriff's office. Charges were filed: trespassing, destruction of property, harassment, and conspiracy to defraud residents through fake citations. The sheriff personally came to take statements. Evelyn tried to bluff her way out, claiming it was community gardening cleanup, but the evidence was overwhelming. She was arrested within a week. Her mugshot made the local papers. Brendan, stoic as ever, gave one brief interview to the press, emphasizing the importance of standing up to abuse of authority. With Evelyn gone and the board restructured, Rich was given a written apology from the HOA and full reimbursement for all prior fines. More importantly, the new board invited residents to review and revise the bylaws for fairness and clarity. Brendan replanted the garden alongside his father, this time with neighbors helping bring rare succulents, desert flowers, and a commemorative plaque that read, "Justice grows here." For the first time in months, Rich sat on his porch, sipping coffee as hummingbirds flitted around the blooms. The war was over. Peace had returned. In every cactus stood tall not just as plants, but as symbols of resistance. The HOA had underestimated an old man's resilience and his son's tenacity. They would never make that mistake again.